November 1952. Dwight Eisenhower has just won the presidency by promising to end the Korean War that has dragged on for over 2 years. The war MacArthur started brilliantly with the Incheon landing, then nearly lost by pushing to the Chinese border, then was fired for wanting to expand into World War III. Now Eisenhower must clean up the mess. He flies to Korea in secret, fulfilling his campaign promise, and what he sees horrifies him. Soldiers dying for hills that will be abandoned, battles fought for no strategic purpose, negotiations stalled while casualties mount. What Eisenhower says when he returns reveals a president who understands that ending MacArthur's war will require doing everything MacArthur refused to do. Accept limitations, negotiate seriously, and recognize that some wars cannot be won, only stopped. This is the story of how Eisenhower inherited military genius's disaster and turned it into pragmatic peace. Subscribe for more stories about MacArthur's decisions and their consequences. When Eisenhower takes office in January 1953, the Korean War has been stalemated for nearly 2 years. The front lines sit roughly where they were before the war started, near the 38th parallel. Ridgway's competent command has stabilized the military situation and demonstrated that United Nations forces can hold their positions and inflict heavy casualties on communist forces. But the war continues with no end in sight. Armistice negotiations at Panmunjom have dragged on for months, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while soldiers die in battles that change nothing strategically. This is the war that MacArthur's initial brilliance and subsequent disasters created, and now it is Eisenhower's responsibility to end it. What Eisenhower says privately to his advisors reveals his frustration with the situation he has inherited. He tells them that the war makes no strategic sense. The original objective of repelling North Korean aggression has been achieved. South Korea has been preserved. But the war continues because both sides are unwilling to accept armistice terms that would formalize the stalemate. Americans are dying to hold positions that have no intrinsic value, fighting battles that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating resolve. Eisenhower, who commanded millions of soldiers in World War II and understands warfare at strategic level, recognizes this as waste of lives that must be stopped. But stopping it requires solving political and diplomatic problems that MacArthur never bothered to address. The secret trip to Korea in December 1952, before taking office, gives Eisenhower first-hand view of the battlefield reality. He visits frontline units, talks to soldiers and commanders, and examines the defensive positions that UN forces are holding. What he sees confirms his assessment that the war has become pointless attrition. The soldiers are competent and disciplined, thanks to Ridgway's reforms, but they are fighting for no clear purpose beyond preventing communist advance. The casualties are steady, but not catastrophic. The military situation is stable, but not improving. This is war that could continue indefinitely without resolution unless political leadership decides to end it. MacArthur had promised victory and delivered disaster. Truman had fired MacArthur but could not end the war. Now it is Eisenhower's problem. What distinguishes Eisenhower's approach from both MacArthur's and Truman's is his willingness to accept that ending the war matters more than the specific terms of the armistice. MacArthur had demanded total victory and refused to accept limitations. Truman had been paralyzed by fear of appearing weak or giving communists propaganda victory. Eisenhower understands that getting American soldiers out of Korea serves American interests more than continuing to fight for marginal improvements in armistice terms. He tells his national security team that his priority is ending the war quickly, even if that means making concessions that MacArthur would have found intolerable, and that Truman feared would be politically costly. The strategic context that Eisenhower inherits is shaped entirely by MacArthur's decisions and their consequences. The initial North Korean invasion succeeded because MacArthur had withdrawn American forces from Korea, believing it was strategically unimportant. The Incheon landing reversed the war through brilliant operational planning. The advance to the Yalu River provoked Chinese intervention that MacArthur insisted was impossible. The disaster that followed led to MacArthur's dismissal and the stalemate that Eisenhower must now resolve. Every aspect of the situation bears MacArthur's fingerprints, and Eisenhower must fix problems that MacArthur's certainty and refusal to accept limitations created. What Eisenhower says about this burden is characteristically understated. He simply notes that the situation is what it is, and that his job is to end the war rather than to assign blame for how it became stalemated. One of Eisenhower's most controversial decisions in ending the Korean War is his use of nuclear threats as diplomatic pressure. In the spring of 1953, through diplomatic channels and deliberate leaks, Eisenhower lets it be known that if armistice negotiations do not produce agreement soon, the United States might consider using nuclear weapons to break the stalemate. This is exactly the kind of nuclear saber-rattling that MacArthur had advocated and that Truman had rejected as too dangerous. But Eisenhower's approach is fundamentally different from MacArthur's in crucial ways that determine whether nuclear threats are reckless escalation or calculated diplomacy. What Eisenhower says privately about the nuclear threats reveals sophisticated understanding that MacArthur lacked. Eisenhower has no intention of actually using nuclear weapons in Korea. He understands, as MacArthur never did, that nuclear weapons have political and strategic consequences far beyond their immediate military effects. Using them would terrify American allies, give the Soviet Union excuse for escalation, and establish precedent that nuclear weapons are acceptable battlefield tools. These costs outweigh any military benefit, but threatening to use nuclear weapons serves diplomatic purpose by creating uncertainty in Beijing and Moscow about American intentions. Communist negotiators cannot be certain that Eisenhower is bluffing, and this uncertainty creates pressure to reach agreement before the situation escalates beyond control. The difference between Eisenhower's nuclear threats and MacArthur's nuclear advocacy is that Eisenhower is using nuclear weapons as diplomatic tool while MacArthur wanted to use them as military solution. MacArthur genuinely believed nuclear weapons should be deployed to destroy Chinese forces and bases. Eisenhower understands that the value of nuclear weapons in limited war is their threat, not their use. The mere possibility that America might use them creates negotiating leverage that can produce diplomatic outcomes that serve American interests. This subtle distinction between threatening nuclear use and actually intending nuclear use is lost on critics who see Eisenhower as merely implementing MacArthur's reckless strategy, but it is the difference between diplomatic pressure and military escalation. What makes Eisenhower's nuclear bluff effective is that it is paired with genuine diplomatic flexibility on other issues. While he creates pressure through nuclear threats, he also signals willingness to compromise on prisoner repatriation, the issue that has stalled negotiations for months. MacArthur would have refused compromise on principle, demanding that communist negotiators accept American terms or face military consequences. Eisenhower understands that successful diplomacy requires giving the other side face-saving concessions while creating pressure on issues where you need them to yield. The nuclear threats make communist negotiators fear escalation, while the diplomatic flexibility gives them way to end the war without appearing to capitulate. This combination of pressure and compromise is sophisticated statecraft that MacArthur's total victory philosophy could never accommodate. The historical debate about whether Eisenhower's nuclear threats actually influenced communist decision to reach armistice, or whether other factors were more important, continues. What is clear is that armistice was signed in July 1953, just months after Eisenhower took office, ending war that had seemed intractable. Eisenhower himself believed that the nuclear threats contributed to this outcome by creating urgency that had been missing from negotiations. What he says in his memoirs is carefully worded to suggest that nuclear threats played a role without claiming they were decisive. This measured assessment reflects Eisenhower's understanding that multiple factors combined to end the war and that claiming sole credit would be inaccurate. But he also makes clear that he was willing to use tools that Truman had been reluctant to employ, including nuclear threats, while maintaining the restraint that MacArthur lacked about actually using nuclear weapons. The most important thing Eisenhower says about ending the Korean War is that the armistice, which formalizes stalemate near the 38th parallel, represents acceptable outcome that serves American interests. This is direct repudiation of MacArthur's total victory philosophy and recognition that limited war for limited objectives is appropriate strategy for nuclear age. MacArthur had argued that anything less than victory was defeat, and that accepting stalemate meant sacrificing American soldiers for nothing. Eisenhower understands that preserving South Korean independence without triggering World War III is precisely the victory that American interests require, even though it lacks the dramatic satisfaction of total military triumph. What Eisenhower tells the American public about the armistice is carefully framed to manage expectations and explain why stalemate is acceptable outcome. He emphasizes that the war's objective was always to repel aggression and preserve South Korea, not to unify the peninsula or to defeat China. By that measure, the armistice achieves American objectives. South Korea remains independent and will eventually become democratic and prosperous. American credibility in defending allies has been maintained. The war has been contained to Korea without expanding into general Asian war that MacArthur's strategy would have risked. These are real achievements that justify the costs, even though the outcome is stalemate rather than victory. The political challenge Eisenhower faces in selling stalemate to American public is significant because MacArthur's rhetoric about total victory has shaped public expectations. Many Americans believe that the Korean War should end with communist defeat and unified democratic Korea. The idea that American soldiers died to preserve a stalemate seems unsatisfying and raises questions about whether their sacrifice was worthwhile. Eisenhower must explain that limited war requires accepting limited outcomes, and that measuring success by territorial conquest or enemy defeat is inappropriate for conflicts where the objective is containment rather than conquest. This is subtle argument that requires public to understand strategic realities that MacArthur had consistently denied. What makes Eisenhower's acceptance of stalemate historically significant is that it establishes precedent for how America fights subsequent Cold War conflicts. The principle that limited objectives requiring limited means defines acceptable strategy, that stalemate can represent success when the alternative is escalation that risks catastrophic war, that preserving alliances and maintaining credibility matters more than dramatic military victory. All of these concepts that Eisenhower demonstrates in Korea shape American Cold War strategy for decades. Vietnam, where subsequent presidents failed to maintain these principles and sought military victory that served no strategic purpose, demonstrates the cost of forgetting the lessons that Eisenhower learned from MacArthur's failures in Korea. The personal contrast between Eisenhower and MacArthur on the question of stalemate versus victory is instructive. MacArthur never accepted that the Korean War ended appropriately. He spent his remaining years arguing that political restrictions prevented necessary victory and that accepting stalemate was betrayal of American soldiers who died fighting. Eisenhower, who also had been supreme commander with millions of lives under his authority, understood that leadership sometimes means accepting outcomes that are strategically sound, even when they are emotionally unsatisfying. What Eisenhower says about MacArthur's inability to accept limitations is respectful but clear. Military genius that cannot accept political constraints becomes liability rather than asset, and that democracy requires military leaders who understand that war serves political objectives rather than demanding that politics conform to military preferences. When Eisenhower reviews the history of the Korean War as he prepares to end it, he is struck by how many of the problems he must now solve trace directly to MacArthur's decisions and his certainty that his strategic vision was correct. The initial vulnerability of South Korea resulted from MacArthur's assessment that Korea was strategically unimportant. The Chinese intervention resulted from MacArthur's certainty that China would not dare to confront American military power. The prolonged stalemate resulted from MacArthur's advocacy for expanded war that Truman rejected, leaving the conflict frozen with no clear path to resolution. At every stage, MacArthur's confidence in his own judgment, his refusal to accept limitations, and his inability to consider that he might be wrong created problems that others had to solve. What Eisenhower says about MacArthur's certainty is more charitable than MacArthur deserves, but also more damning than obvious criticism would be. Eisenhower acknowledges that MacArthur was a brilliant commander with proven record of success. The Incheon landing demonstrated operational genius that few commanders could match. MacArthur's service to the nation across 5 decades was distinguished and honorable. But Eisenhower also notes that brilliance untempered by humility becomes dangerous, that certainty unmodified by willingness to consider contrary evidence leads to catastrophic errors, and that military genius that refuses to accept political constraints ultimately fails regardless of tactical skill. These observations apply directly to MacArthur's performance in Korea, while avoiding personal attacks that would be unseemly from one 5-star general discussing another. The specific costs of MacArthur's certainty that Eisenhower must address include damaged alliance relationships, strained civil-military relations, and prolonged conflict that serves no American interest. MacArthur's public advocacy for expanding the war to China terrified American allies and created doubts about whether civilian leadership actually controlled American military policy. His dismissal, while necessary, created political crisis that weakened the Truman administration and made ending the war more difficult. The stalemate that resulted from inability to pursue MacArthur's expanded war, while also being unable to negotiate acceptable armistice, killed thousands of American soldiers in battles that achieved nothing. All of these problems stem from MacArthur's refusal to accept that his role was to execute policy, rather than to determine it through public pressure and insubordination. What Eisenhower learns from MacArthur's failures shapes his own approach to military leadership as president. Eisenhower understands from his experience commanding Allied forces in World War II that success requires accepting political constraints and working within them. He knows that alliance politics matter as much as military capability, and that maintaining coalition unity requires compromise and flexibility. He recognizes that limited war requires different strategy than total war, and that applying World War II thinking to Cold War conflicts produces disasters like MacArthur created in Korea. Most importantly, Eisenhower understands that presidential responsibility means making decisions that serve long-term strategic interests, even when those decisions are politically costly or emotionally unsatisfying. The final assessment Eisenhower makes of MacArthur's legacy in Korea is that brilliance without wisdom is a dangerous combination. MacArthur had brilliant operational mind that conceived Incheon landing and executed it flawlessly. But he lacked the strategic wisdom to recognize when to stop, when to accept limitations, and when to acknowledge that his certainty might be wrong. The result was that his brilliance produced both spectacular success and catastrophic failure in the same campaign. Eisenhower's task in ending the Korean War is essentially to preserve the benefits of MacArthur's success at Incheon while mitigating the costs of his failure at the Yalu River. This requires accepting stalemate that MacArthur would have considered defeat, negotiating with enemies that MacArthur wanted to destroy, and recognizing that sometimes the best outcome is simply stopping the fighting rather than achieving dramatic victory. What Eisenhower said when he inherited MacArthur's war defined approach to Cold War strategy that would characterize American foreign policy for decades. The principles Eisenhower established in ending the Korean War, that limited objectives require limited means, that stalemate can represent success when the alternative is unacceptable escalation, that maintaining alliances and avoiding World War III matters more than achieving dramatic military victories, shaped how America fought subsequent Cold War conflicts with varying success. When these principles were followed, as in Eisenhower's handling of various crises during his presidency, outcomes generally served American interests. When these principles were forgotten, as in Vietnam, the results were catastrophic. The immediate outcome of Eisenhower's approach was armistice signed in July 1953 that ended active combat in Korea. The armistice was not peace treaty, and technically the war never ended, which remains true 70 years later. But active fighting stopped, American casualties ended, and South Korea was preserved as independent state that eventually became democratic and economically prosperous. These outcomes vindicated Eisenhower's judgment that accepting stalemate was an appropriate conclusion to war that served its essential purpose of containing communist expansion without triggering World War III. MacArthur's vision of total victory would have required expanded war with China and possibly nuclear weapons, creating risks that far outweighed any benefit from unifying Korea under democratic control. The strategic lesson Eisenhower drew from the Korean experience was that nuclear weapons fundamentally changed the nature of warfare and required completely different approach to military strategy than had prevailed in pre-nuclear age. Total war of the kind America had fought against Germany and Japan, seeking unconditional surrender and complete military victory, was no longer appropriate strategy when both sides had nuclear weapons. Limited war for limited objectives, using conventional forces while nuclear weapons remained in background as deterrent rather than battlefield weapon, became the model that Eisenhower implemented throughout his presidency. This represented explicit rejection of MacArthur's total war philosophy and recognition that nuclear age required restraint that MacArthur's generation of military leaders often lacked. What makes Eisenhower's handling of MacArthur's war particularly significant is that it demonstrated presidential leadership at its most effective. Eisenhower had the military credibility to make decisions about war and peace that would have been questioned if made by a civilian president with no military experience. He could end the war by accepting stalemate without being accused of weakness or lack of understanding about military necessity. He could reject MacArthur's expanded war strategy without being accused of political interference with military judgment. His success in ending the Korean War demonstrated that military expertise informed by strategic wisdom matters more than tactical brilliance untempered by political understanding. The final words Eisenhower says about inheriting MacArthur's war come in his memoirs, written years after leaving office when the emotions of the moment had faded and historical perspective was possible. He acknowledges that MacArthur's Incheon landing was a brilliant stroke that saved South Korea from conquest. But he also notes that MacArthur's subsequent decisions, his advance to the Yalu River despite warnings, his certainty that China would not intervene, his advocacy for expanded war that would have risked World War III, all demonstrated flaws in judgment that made his dismissal necessary. Eisenhower's task was to end the war that resulted from these decisions while preserving the benefits of MacArthur's initial success. He did so by accepting limitations that MacArthur refused to acknowledge and by recognizing that sometimes ending a war matters more than winning it in the traditional sense. This wisdom, learned from MacArthur's failures and applied to resolve the crisis those failures created, represents presidential leadership at its most essential, the willingness to make decisions that serve long-term strategic interests, even when those decisions lack the dramatic satisfaction of total military victory. Subscribe for more stories about the decisions MacArthur made and the leaders who dealt with the consequences.